Greem suddenly shuddered, shaking him out of his deep meditative state. Greem sat up on his bed, panting. He could still vividly remember what he just experienced in his dream. He could even feel a bit of the burning pain he had received from the white speck. Was it an illusion? A dream? Perhaps it was something else. Greem began to feel a certain sense of bewilderment and confusion. He had meditated countless times before, and every time it had been a vague experience. Only rarely did he feel anything even slightly spiritual. As for that last dream, it was like he was in control of himself while dreaming. "Chip, run a self-scan." Greem, having suddenly thought of something, gave the chip an order. *beep**, beginning scan of the host's body. Scan completed. Saving self-test report. Following the messages from the chip, a new self-scan report was projected into his mind. As expected, some abnormal changes had occurred in his body. If not because the chip could perform an accurate detection down to the cellular level, Greem would never know that the deep meditation just now had actually increased his spirit by 0.03 and his experience by 2. That meant that the dreamlike state he had experienced just now was not an illusion, but had really happened. So what were those colored specks of light? Right when the question arose in his mind, the answer came to him. Elementrum. Every person who had the talent to become adept would have a different elemental affinity. Those colored specks of light he saw during meditation were actually bits of elementrum flowing through the world around him. As his elemental affinity was fire, those red specks, which were drawn toward him, like bugs toward a bright light, were actually fire elementrum. According to the elementrum classifications done by Adepts, his affinity toward red fire elementrum was the highest. After that was the green plant elementrum and the yellow earth elementrum. As for the others, he did not have an affinity to them as they were repelled by the elementrum which he had an affinity to. As for the white speck that Greem had caught during his meditation, it must have been dark elementrum. Because it did not match with Greem's affinity, it would be at least 10 times, or even 100 times, more difficult for him to catch compared to elementrum he had an affinity for. Besides that, although these dark elementrum could still increase his spirit by a tiny amount, they would also hurt his body at the same time. In his memory, the few apprentice adepts he knew who had dark elementrum as their primary elemental affinity, didn't have very healthy bodies and they always looked like a gust of wind could knock them down. Perhaps the corrosiveness of the dark elementrum was the cause of their frailty. It seems that the innate elemental affinity of an apprentice could affect the efficiency of their meditation, and that efficiency could, in turn, increase the growth rate of the apprentice's spirit. Greem tried to recall what he experienced back when he was meditating, and what he remembered made him frown. According to his memory, the numbers of white dark elementrum specks was clearly far more than the number of red fire elementrum specks. That meant that, in this environment, the efficiency of meditation for those apprentices who had an affinity for dark elementrum was way higher than his own. How was this possible? Shouldn't the distribution of the basic elementrum in this world be relatively balanced? Could it be that the adept of the tower did this purposefully? Suddenly, Greem's face took on a ghastly pallor. He had just remembered that Master of the Tower, Adept Anderson, had affinities for dark and wind elementrum. No wonder that many of the other apprentice adepts who had joined the tower around the same time as Greem had mastered 2 or 3 spells and managed to rank up to intermediate apprentice, while he was still struggling down the path of a beginner apprentice. It was not only his own innate talent that tied him down. It was this damn harsh environment. Greem thought for a second, then he gave up the idea of meditating again. For a beginner apprentice adept like him, although meditation could increase his spirit, it still couldn't replace sleeping. Therefore, in order to restore spirit in a fast and efficient manner, calming his mind and sleeping was the best way to go. Looking at his own spirit, which had been reduced to half, Greem shook his head and smiled bitterly. Then he threw himself back on his bed and fell into a deep slumber. The next day, Greem, who was sleeping soundly, was awoken suddenly by an alarm from the chip. To his surprise, the spiritual model of the burning hand had been solidified by the chip. Over the next few seconds, all the data regarding this spiritual model flowed into Greem's mind. The burning hand was a low-grade fire spell capable of engaging foes in both offense and defense, but it was not considered a powerful spell. However, the spiritual model of it showed that it was formed from many magic words, 28, in fact. Each of these 28 magic words was nearly impossible to pronounce and had its own unique independent usage. While it may appear that each of them was unrelated, when they were put together in a specific formation, they would become a complete magic model, capable of unleashing magical forces on the physical world. If this task was handed to an ordinary man, asking him to memorize 28 independent but closely connected magic syllables, then to recite them without missing a single one. Most mortals wouldn't be able to achieve this, as just speaking a single spell word required great control and energy. When he first arrived in this world, he didn't believe he would be able to do that. But in this bizarre world, where elemental energy was everywhere, he actually accomplished this fairly easily. Of course, this had something to do with his 8 points of spirit energy. In the past, reciting the burning hand spell, which consisted of 28 magic syllables, took Greem 5 to 7 seconds. But, now that it had been solidified, Greem didn't need to waste time reciting the spell. All he needed to do was to inject his elemental energy into the model of burning hand in his mind. This meant that it only took him 2 to 3 seconds to release a complete version of burning hand. Moreover, in the future, when he improved his fire elemental mastery, the duration of casting would be further shortened. But that was not the only good news. As this was a spiritual model that had been pre-solidified in his mind, it no longer required as much of his spirit energy to construct it. The result of this was that the burning hand spell, which used to deplete his spirit by 2 when casting, now only depleted his spirit by 1. Didn't that mean the number of times he could cast spells in the future had doubled? This discovery brought a big smile to his face as his mind was wildly dreaming up many possible uses for this particular ability. But then the chip, once again, resounded in his mind. *beep*, discovered room for improvement of this spell model. Please confirm if the host wants to optimize. Attention, this optimization will cost 1 spirit per day, and 100 experience. Estimated time for the task is 34 hours and 25 minutes. Huh? Optimize the burning hand. It sounded like something really good. But why did it consume so much experience? If any operation related to spiritual models cost him this many experience points, perhaps all the experience points he accumulated in the past 6 years would be used up in the next few days. Greem calmed himself down and took a moment to ponder this optimization. After a few moments he decided to decline. First off, Burning Hand was just a close-ranged spell. It didn't have much potential combat value in Greem's mind. Sooner or later, it would be replaced by other long-ranged offensive or defensive spells which were more valuable, therefore it wasn't worth investing in it now. Second, taking his current spirit energy into consideration, he couldn't have more than 3 solidified models in his spiritual domain. Under this situation, where only limited slots were available, giving Burning Hand a space in his spiritual domain clearly didn't match up with his optimized path. In fact, Greem himself would have preferred to prioritize the solidification of a long-range attack spell, and he had a specific spell in mind for this very purpose. This was a fire spell that he had studied and researched for nearly half a year. Fire Arrow. Fire Arrow, a low-grade fire elemental spell. The spell allowed him to form a magical arrow of fire elementum and throw it at his target, causing 7 points of physical damage and 18 points of fire and explosive damage. With Grimm's pitiful 3 physique and 11 health points, a fire arrow was more than enough to instantly kill him. Therefore, all this time Grimm had been dreaming of learning this long-ranged attack spell. But too bad, although Fire Arrow was a low-grade spell, it consisted of 34 spell words. This was the reason why, even though he had been restlessly studying for half a year, he still hadn't mastered the method of constructing its spiritual model. Grimm had invested more than 20 knowledge points and a huge amount of time in learning this Fire Arrow spell. It even delayed his research into magic knowledge. However, he was still lingering outside the door of success, and far from becoming an elite among the beginner apprentice adepts, mastering more than 2 spells. But now, with the help of the chip, presumably this doorway had come much closer. Ignoring the fact that it was time for breakfast, Grimm hurriedly washed his face, then sat in front of his writing table, excitedly opening up his magic notebook. Everything related to the magical model of the Fire Arrow, the magic words of it, the frequency of the spirit energy, and the material of the spell construct, Grimm had copied all of them into this notebook. Real spellcasting was not as simple as ordinary people thought it was. 34 syllables of magic couldn't be recited in one go like how they were written. A spell couldn't be cast just like that. The entire process was an extremely complicated process and required the perfect combination of hand, mouth, heart, and mind. It was the result of them working together. When reciting each syllable, Grimm needed to adjust his spirit to a matching vibrational frequency, and both of his hands had to perform a specific gesture. Any mistake or delay in the casting process and the only result would be a casting blowback. Although this kind of casting blowback wouldn't kill an apprentice, it would cause damage to his spirit, and it would take him a long time to recover. Also, if one's spirit was frequently damaged, there was a possibility that they could suffer a permanent reduction in their spirit. 3 days later. With disheveled hair, a dirty face, and 2 red eyes, Grimm breathed out a long sigh and closed the book sitting on the table in front of him. A moment ago, the chip's alert tone, which he had been waiting on for a long time, had finally resounded in his brain. Beep data model of Fire Arrow has been constructed successfully. Finally. Thinking back, the Burning Hand was a spell Grimm had mastered completely. So long as he could cast it once, the chip would be able to visualize its model in Grimm's spiritual dimension via precisely monitoring how he controlled his spirit energy and the spiritual frequency he had used. It had been so simple and easy. But Grimm hadn't mastered the Fire Arrow spell, he couldn't even successfully cast it even once. Thus, the chip's ability to record, store, and mimic his spells were unable to be used. So Grimm had to find another method, and thus he memorized all related magic theories and casting techniques of Fire Arrow. Then he let the chip proceed with the arrangement and sorting of them, analyzing them to find out the best casting technique that matched him most precisely. The data model the chip had constructed with this method wouldn't replace a real spiritual model, which made this a unique spell experiment, rather than the actualization of a spell. Grimm massaged his forehead and took a few deep breaths. After that, he said, "Let's begin the simulation." Beep. With a crystal-clear alert tone, a nearly perfect virtual image of Grimm was projected into his mind. Following the specifications of the data model, it started to recite the spell words of Fire Arrow in a sonorous, yet forceful, voice. Via his connection with the chip, Grimm's mind merged with the virtual image, following along with the reciting of the spell and adjusting the frequency of his spirit to match that of the data model. At the same time, both hands of the virtual image were making small gestures in the air, guiding the attracted elemental energy and molding it into the shape of an arrow. Too bad, due to his unfamiliarity with the casting, when he was reciting the 14th magic word, its hand gesture was clearly a half-second slower. Within Grimm's spiritual world, the half-molded fire arrow exploded, and a raging fireball instantly swallowed the virtual image. If it was in the real world, perhaps nearly half of Grimm's room would have been destroyed, but in this virtual world, simulated with his spirit energy, after the violent wobbling of lights and shadows, the perfectly simulated explosion disappeared, and the entire scene was restored to its initial state. Although he knew beforehand that everything was just a simulation, Grimm still couldn't help breaking into a non-existent cold sweat in his spiritual world. Witnessing a huge fireball explode in front of his eyes, and seeing his virtual body being ripped apart, even Grimm, who was not faint of heart, felt his heart stop for a second. In order to let himself truly experience the complete process of casting the spell, Grimm had placed his entire conscious into the virtual image. Therefore, you could say what happened just now, while not being real, could be described as an unreal reality. Grimm didn't jump right back into practicing, but closed his eyes, meticulously studying his first attempt in his mind. After he confirmed the reason for his mistake, he opened his eyes and began his second simulated casting attempt. Unfortunately, it was a failure again. This time, he failed at matching his spirit frequency with the 17th syllable. The half-constructed spiritual model exploded once again. As a result, the raging element flames once more swallowed Grimm's virtual body. The digitized wobbling of lights and shadows slowly faded. Soon, his spiritual world was restored to its initial state. Grimm let out a helpless and bitter laugh, then he took a moment to calm down. Soon, the sonorous and forceful voice of the simulated Grimm's voice once again resounded throughout the empty spiritual world. Many explosions occurred. Every time, his mistake was nearly the same. Either his hand gestures couldn't keep up with the spell's syllables, or his spirit frequency wasn't right. To put it simply, no matter which part caused the problem, there was only one result, a massive explosion. If this had happened in the real world, Grimm's weak body would have become powder after the first explosion. But since it was not, he was sitting safely beside his writing table, staring blankly into space. After practicing it so many times, his spirit had finally been depleted. Whenever his spirit was completely depleted, he would struggle back to his bed and fall asleep. Once he had slept and restored his spirit, he would then rush to the cafeteria, order himself a huge meal, then return to his room and commence the next round of spell simulation practice. With this incredible persistence and fortitude, finally, during an instance when everything worked flawlessly, Grimm successfully completed a simulated casting of fire arrow. When the burning elemental flame formed into a magic arrow and was stably floating between Grimm's hands, he nearly couldn't hold back his tears. When he let himself get excited, a massive explosion, once again, devoured his body again. But he didn't get discouraged this time. Instead, he let out a loud and satisfied laugh while his spiritual world was destroyed around him. Grimm sat up straight in front of the writing table, opening his eyes for the first time in a few hours. A look of joy could be seen at the corners of said eyes. "Chip, do you have a recording of my last simulated spell attempt? Video has been recorded and saved. You can replay it at any time." Grimm tried his best to calm down and nodded his head, but the way he tightly clenched his fists revealed how excited he was. This newfound function of the chip was really a huge help to him. Without the virtual spiritual world constructed by the chip, Grimm could only practice this fire arrow spell in the spell practice room over and over. He would have to personally endure the backfire to his spirit and body caused by his casting failures. Every serious casting backfire would require a period of time to heal and rest before being fully recovered. No doubt this would seriously delay the progress of learning any spell or progressing one's spirit. This was the reason most of the apprentices in the tower only mastered 1 to 2 spells. Of course, there was a possibility that some apprentices had hidden what they knew, never really exposing their true abilities. After all, the field of research and progress for all apprentices was secretive, and trying to learn about one's private matters was a huge taboo within the tower. There probably were not that many apprentices hiding what they knew, as the number of unlucky guys who were struggling, even among beginner apprentice adepts, was really quite high, and thus there was very little need to hide one's abilities. In the past, Grimm was one of them. But with the activation of the chip, Grimm felt it was time for him to soar up into the sky. Chip, play the recording of the successful casting. Beep asterisk, with the appearance of data streams, Grimm, who was concentrating on spell casting, was projected into his mind. Grimm placed his entire focus on this virtual image, repeatedly watching the entire process of spell casting. He watched every detail of it, not missing the slightest change in his spiritual energy. Although it was only a spiritual simulation, Grimm's mind followed the normal spellcasting process and completed it. Therefore, excluding the lack of real elemental energy, nothing was different when compared to casting the spell in the real world. It went without saying that this recording of a successful spellcasting would go a long way in helping Grimm master the magic spell. At least, it helped Grimm save at least half a year of restless effort, and avoided the painful cycle of being injured, resting and healing, and being injured again. Since he had a single success out of 100 attempts, that meant that Grimm's knowledge and ability were enough to support the minimum requirement for casting the fire arrow spell. Thus, the only obstacle that preventing him from mastering the fire arrow was his familiarity with casting the spell. And this was the strength of the chip. After repeatedly reviewing the successful simulated casting, and making sure he had mastered all the key elements of the spell, Grimm hurried out of his room and went straight to the magic spell practice room. This was also one of the inconveniences that an apprentice adept had to face. Their mastery in magic spells was too low, which made the consequence of practicing an unfamiliar magic spell in their own room too severe. Thus, the only option for them was to rent the magic spell practice room in the tower, allowing them to experiment with a new spell. That's why there was a saying, the mastery of a new magic spell was always supported by the huge amount of knowledge, and an incredible amount of money. The magic spell practice room was located on the 3rd floor of the tower and was set up to handle any mishaps that a backfiring spell might cause. Although he was part of the tower, apprentice adepts were only allowed to set foot on the 1st to 3rd floors. The 1st floor was mainly for probationary apprentices, who had only recently joined the tower. The 2nd floor was the living quarters and recreational areas for official apprentice adepts. The 3rd floor was a public area where they could experiment with magic spells and practice. The area where official apprentices were allowed included the library, the potion brewing room, the summoning room, the alchemy laboratory, the magic spell practice room, the room of seals, the curse altar, the magical plant cultivation room. But as a lone wolf who always by himself, the only places that Grimm normally visited were the library and the magic spell practice room. As for all the other places, he did not have deep enough pockets to waste money visiting them. It was dinner time when he arrived, hence, there weren't many apprentices at this place. After Grimm impatiently paid 10 gold coins to Am, who was the administrator of the magic spell practice room, he was given a special card. With this card, he had an hour of practicing time in a practice room. For an apprentice adept, an hour of practicing time was considering pretty long. With their pitiful amount of spiritual energy, they couldn't last more than half an hour of continuous spellcasting. If Grimm didn't control the output of his spiritual energy, he could deplete it all within 15 minutes. Grimm walked up to a stone door that had a number above it that matched the number on his card. He raised up the card and waved it gently in the air. The heavy stone door immediately opened up, not making any noise as it did so. The so-called magic spell practice room was, in fact, a simple stone room that had about 40 square meters of space, but there was a gigantic human-shaped target, made of stone, placed on the other end of the room. The dull and dark material showed that it was made from a dark augite stone, which was capable of repelling magic. With the ability of an apprentice adept, the low-grade magic spells they were able to experiment with were definitely not enough to destroy such a solid and strong magic-repelling stone target. That's why it was the most suitable target for magic practice. Of course, for those apprentices who needed to practice their curse spells, or some other unique types of spells, they had no choice but spend money to purchase some suitable demons as their practicing target, or else they would have to sneak outside the tower, where they could practice those bizarre spells in secret. After the stone door closed, the practice room became a soundproof space, and Grimm wouldn't have to worry that someone might spy upon what he was doing from the outside. Grimm took 2 steps forward, positioning himself right in the center of a strange-looking spell formation that was about 2 meters in diameter. He couldn't recognize a single spell drawn on it. Clearly, they were far beyond the knowledge of any beginner apprentice adept. But today he had no time or energy to bother with all these minor details. He turned around and stood with his back straight, quietly recalling the entire casting process of the fire arrow spell. After he was certain of the casting process, he started speaking in a solemn voice, "Chip. Pay close attention to the entire process. Correct me immediately if you think I am making the slightest mistake. Beep *, new task established, commencing real-time monitoring." As a blue light began blinking in Grimm's eyes, a digitized scene was projected onto his retinas. The digitized practice room looked exactly like the practice room, but countless tiny dots of blue nodes had appeared on Grimm's retinas, slicing up the entire room into countless tiny regions. Also, the body movements Grimm required to perform were divided into countless still virtual images, each staged in such a way as to indicate an order he must follow. Which was exactly what he needed to do, follow the movements of these virtual images. Finally, Grimm, who had been standing still, looking blankly off into space, began to practice. He started to recite the magic words, and, at the same time, making drawing movements in front of his chest at an incredibly fast speed. These movements made him look weird, but at the same time, seemed to possess a certain flowing grace. As Grimm progressed through the spell, his body started to blink red as a huge amount of fire elementum was summoned by his spell, slowly compressing and forming into the shape of an arrow in between his moving hands. Perhaps the process had been too smooth, but right when he was reciting the 30-second magic syllable, Grimm's heart surged with excitement, and that made one of the nodes of the spiritual model collapse, and the rest of the spiritual model immediately followed. The raging fire elementum, which had been summoned and compressed repeatedly, became unaligned, and a ground-shaking explosion of fire elementum started erupting in front of Grimm. But, right at the moment when everything started to fall out of order, Grimm, who had been prepared for the unexpected, forcefully slammed on the card placed in front of his chest. The card vibrated, and a magic barrier surged up from the spell formation under his feet, encasing his body and the exploding fire arrow. Strangely, once the raging fire elements were covered by the magic barrier, their power was reduced by half. Therefore, a potentially ground-shaking explosion of elementum was suppressed and came out as a small fireworks show. After a dull noise, which sounded like a firecracker, Green was submerged by thick and dark smoke, and a small flame could be briefly seen through the smoke. A moment later, Green dashed out from the smoke while continuously coughing. Damn it. I thought I was going to succeed. His face was smudged by thick smoke, and his clothes were full of burn marks, making him look like a homeless man who had been dragged through a fire. Although he was caught right in the center of the explosion, the power of the raging fire elementum was suppressed by the magic formation. Therefore, only his hands and forehead were licked by the flames. He didn't really suffer from any injuries except minor burns. His first real casting attempt had failed. And the cause of it was actually Grimm's weak control over his own emotions. As he felt he was going to succeed, he let his excitement get the best of him, and that emotional outburst had disturbed the spellcasting process. After letting the dark smoke clear from the room, he tidied up his appearance and applied some medicinal paste on his wounds. Only then did he step back into the spell formation. Gritted his teeth tightly, Grimm began his second spellcasting attempt. Perhaps he was being rewarded for all his perseverance in the past few weeks, or perhaps fate had decided it was time for him to master the spell, but the second spellcasting went smoothly and swiftly. After a seemingly unendingly long 13 seconds of casting, Grimm finally completed a successful casting of the fire arrow spell. When the raging fire elementum had concentrated and formed into a complete fire arrow in his palm, the sweet mechanical voice of the chip once again resounded in his brain. Beep asterisk, a complete spiritual model has been detected. Please confirm if the host wants to solidify it. The solidification process will consume 3 spirit and 50 experience. Confirm. Grimm was unable to hold himself back and shouted out loud. Please name this spiritual model. Fire arrow. Model successfully named. Solidification task now starting. Expected completion time is 14 hours, 37 minutes, and 21 seconds. After settling everything with the chip, Grimm still needed to handle the hot potato in his hands. For many exploding spells, the caster only had a buffer of 2 to 3 seconds after casting the spell to use it. If this time was exceeded, or the caster moved their body, the casted spell would begin to collapse. If he cast a spell and let it explode within his palm, he could barely imagine what would happen to his body. Therefore, once Grimm was finished with the chip, he immediately pushed both hands forward, inciting the fire arrow to fly forward and slam right into the stone target situated on the other side of the room. The fire arrow erupted as it struck the chest of the stone target. This time, without the suppression field of the magical formation beneath his feet, the raging fire elementum could finally reveal its brutal and violent nature. A loud explosive noise was heard. A fireball the size of a melon suddenly appeared, quickly spreading into a violent fiery shockwave. The raging explosion instantly heated up everything within a 5-meter radius of the stone target to rather intense temperatures. After the smoke cleared, Grimm could see that the chest of the stone target had been burned black, and there was even a nail-sized hole where the center of the explosion had been. Unexpectedly, a wall on one side of the room began to wobble like the surface of water did when small ripples went through it. After a moment, a few words began to show up. Obviously, this specially designed spell-casting practice room was very effective at its job. Although, with the help of the chip, Grimm didn't need the limited data detected by the spell formation, but all the other apprentice adepts couldn't live without it. Only through the evaluation and calculation of the spell formation could they have a more direct feeling of control when dealing with the spells they were learning. That, or they would have to experience it directly on a battlefield, where they had to put their lives at stake. In just 15 minutes of time, Grimm had achieved his goal for this trip. He happily turned and opened the door to the spellcasting practice room. When the stone door opened up, a beautiful figure was waiting outside the door for him. Slender limbs, perfect curves, fair and silky smooth skin, a delicate face. But what excited Grimm the most was the flaming red chiffon dress and her equally red luscious lips. The only difference compared to the last time he had seen her was that her ruby red eyes were gone, having been replaced by a pair of turquoise blue eyes, which made Grimm felt like he was staring into a sparkling ocean of blue. It was Mary, wearing her vivacious red dress. "Oh, so it seems you really are here, Tilda." Her juicy red lips moved gently, letting out words in a voice that made Grimm's heart race. "All right, since I've found him, you're no longer of any use to me." The second sentence, which was said in a tone that sounded much colder than the first, was not spoken to Grimm. Only now had Grimm noticed that this neighbor of his, who was slim and neither tall nor short, was dragging an adult man with her right hand. It was the administrator of the magic spell practice room. Red-dressed Mary waved her little hand, and was easily thrown over 10 meters. He hit the ground with a thud, and started groaning, unable to stand back up. Grimm felt his expression change. Although was not considering a chunky man, his body weight was at least that of the average adult man. However, this Mary had just thrown him a fairly long distance with a single bare hand, and she had done it without even trying that hard. Inferring from what he had seen in front of him, Grimm guessed that she had, at least, 10 strength. Judging from the swiftness of her movements, her agility was not low either. Together with her frightening vampire ability of regeneration, perhaps even the 3 strongest apprentice adepts wouldn't be able to gain an advantage over her in a fight. Hadn't she been taken away by the master of the tower? How was she here, safe and sound? Follow me. While Grimm was still pondering all of this in his mind, Mary stretched out her fair, silky smooth right hand and grabbed his collar. Then she turned around and strode away, her hand on his neck. Grimm did his best to try and avoid her hand, but he was unable to do so. Although he was only 15 years old, he was actually a little bit taller than Mary. In order to avoid being dragged on the floor, he was forced to stagger along behind her, having no idea what was going on. In the public cafeteria. It was dinner time, so most of the apprentice adepts were gathered in the cafeteria, sitting in small groups, having their meals, and talking to each other. From the places they sat and the way that they each talked, it was enough to determine the strength of these small groups and the position of each apprentice adept in the group. After all, those who were lone wolves, like Grimm, were actually quite few in number. Most of the apprentice adepts preferred to group up and form small gangs, allowing them to work together and fight off those who approached with bad intentions. But, right when the atmosphere of the place was warming up, a sudden loud noise was heard, as the freshly repaired wooden door was smashed open by someone. Every single apprentice adept stared blankly at 2 people who had come in, one after the other. Their widely opened eyes were filled with looks of disbelief. Mary. Although most of the people here had never seen how Mary looked after her mutation, through their own channels, they all knew what had happened that day. Thus, in their mind, even if Mary didn't get sliced by Master Adept for his research, she would have been locked up on one of the upper floors of this tower, forced to live life as a captive forever. In stark contrast to everyone's expectations, she actually shone up in this place, as bold as brass. Ellen, who sat right in the center of the cafeteria, immediately felt his expression turn sober as his eyes were filled with fright. He had personally witnessed how brutal and frightening Mary was. Even though she had been restored to her harmless look, the horrifying memory left in his mind could never be erased. Mary stormed in like a whirlwind, soon coming to stand right in the center of the cafeteria with her arms crossed. She coldly glanced around the room, slowly circling it, before her vision finally stopped on Ellen, the newly appointed apprentice leader. "I, Mary, am back again." After proudly announcing her return from the middle of the cafeteria, Mary shifted her little hand forward, pulling Greem forward and placing him in front of her. "From today onwards, know that he is my subordinate. Anyone who makes trouble for him will have me as your enemy." After she finished saying that, she let go of Greem and swept her right hand through the air. Her claws moved so fast that they seemed to leave after images in the air. As the faint trails of light faded away, 5 sharp whistling noises could be heard by the crowd. What insane agility, and what a terrifying slashing force. With such speed and attack strength, who would have time to recite a spell if she attacked them? After estimating the attack strength of Mary's casual strike, everyone who saw this scene had fear cover their faces. Greem couldn't help but smile wryly at his current situation. For the first time in his entire life, he felt a headache caused by good fortune. As much as he could, he was a man who strived to live a low-profile life, but, in the end, he was helplessly dragged into what could only result in a fight between those strongest apprentice adepts. Though Mary did this out of good intentions, would a simple threat of violence really be able to hold back those apprentice adepts who feared nothing? In this adept tower, where the hearts of men were incomprehensible, and where everyone was scheming against each other, there were nearly infinite methods of killing someone without being noticed. In the library, a wide variety of knowledge of curse spells and poisonous potions were available. So long as someone willing to put in the effort, it wasn't exactly difficult to make an apprentice adept die an unfortunate death, with no one the wiser. Within this eerie and frightening adept tower, Greem would never dare let the slightest drop of blood or the tiniest hair on his head fall into someone else's hands. After all, there were countless bizarre spells which could be used against a person. The slightest mistake could end with him become a puppet controlled by someone else. That was also the reason why most of the apprentice adepts lived in the seclusion of their own rooms, rarely having any intimate physical contact with anyone. Sensing the hostile glances shooting at him from all directions, once again Greem felt speechless, and a bitter smile covered his face. It seems he had found a great method for making a lot of enemies at once. In the past, he was just a harmless low-rank apprentice in other people's minds. Even if he got in some minor arguments, no one would really try to find a method to kill him. But today, he had nearly offended every single apprentice adept in the tower without saying a single word. Without having to think twice, he knew that, from today onwards, he had become a bird of a different feather among all the beginner apprentice adepts. If there was anyone who tried to get in touch with him, either they were probing for Mary's information, or they were plotting his demise. Although Greem was complaining in his mind, right at this moment he had no other option but to put on a poker face and face these new hardships head-on. After delivered what she intended to say, Mary, who had established her authority, grabbed Greem and left the cafeteria in a rush. A moment later, the prideful and elegant Mary had, once again, appeared in front of Anne, who was still suffering from the shock of being thrown across a room. "Give me the card of the arena." Mary was showing herself to be a surprisingly domineering and tyrannical person. As she slammed her tiny palm onto the table, everything on it was knocked over. A slimy and ugly frog squeezed out from the pile of books while croaking continuously, quickly jumping onto Anne's shoulder and angrily staring at Mary, who was the culprit of his discomfort. It was a small frog, but it had a huge head, which was quite strange looking. Its slimy back was full of lumps and blisters, which were all filled with green ooze. It had a huge mouth and its eyes were situated on 2 protruding tentacles, giving it a really bizarre look. Frightened, Anne gently patted on the weird head of the frog, turning his head and speaking softly to it. The frog, unwillingly, opened up its mouth and spat out a special card, which was glowing with a golden glaze. Mary snorted coolly, snatched the golden card off the table, turned around, and then dragged Greem away. Before they left, Greem couldn't help examining the strange-looking frog. A companion beast. Perhaps this frog was Am's company beast. Apprentice adepts, like them, who were still struggling in the lower floors of the tower, were all restlessly trying to strengthen themselves. No doubt, increasing one's spirit was the toughest path. Without a magic medicine that grew one's spirit, a top-grade meditation method, and without a formal adept to answer all their questions, they could only depend on themselves to progress. Therefore, any method that could possibly help one in improving their own power was worth it, and companion beasts were, undeniably, a good supplemental method for increasing one's strength. Companion beasts were also known as parasite beasts. They were a unique type of demon that had been modified and bred with magic. Through a special magic ceremony, an apprentice adept could establish a binding between his soul and one of these beasts. Of course, a method like this came with its own pros and cons. On the bright side, an apprentice adept could borrow the innate abilities of the demon, granting himself some special abilities that others didn't have. On the downside, during the process of establishing the companionship, the apprentice had to cut part of his soul and transfer it to the companion beast. With that, if the companion beast was seriously hurt or died, the apprentice himself would suffer the same fate. If the beast was seriously injured, it might cause the apprentice to suffer a permanent spirit depletion, as his soul would be injured. There were known cases where an adept's soul had broken, causing them to become a complete idiot. It was a rule of thumb that an ordinary apprentice adept could only establish a relationship with one beast. But, as in anything, there was always an exception. Evilbugs, who was one of the 3 strongest apprentices, had taken the path of binding with a companion beast. However, he actually broke through the supposed limit, and somehow had a lot of strange insects within his body. As for how he did that, no one knew. Any apprentice adept who was taking the path of binding with a companion beast would kill for this knowledge, but none of them had the courage to spy on his secret. Because, in the end, anyone who tried to spy on him would end up dead in an accident. Who only had the capability of an intermediate apprentice, had chosen a poison dart frog, who could, unsurprisingly, shoot poisonous darts, as his companion beast. Besides shooting poison, it also had a pretty good regeneration ability. Perhaps, this was the biggest reason Anne had chosen it. When the main door of the stone room had closed up, Mary and Greem were left standing there by themselves in a large room. This arena was way bigger than the stone room Greem had rented previously, taking up a whole 200 square meters. Thus, this was not a place for apprentice adepts to practice their magic spells, but a miniature fighting arena. If apprentice adepts needed to resolve disputes, usually they would use this arena as a last resort. Although this place came with a rule forbidding them from killing each other, if an accident really happened, the killer wouldn't have to pay with their own life. All they would have to do was pay a large fee as compensation. Hence, many apprentice adepts had a great fear of this arena, and, thus, it had earned the nickname of Arena of Death. Mary's slim figure stood opposite of Greem's. She had an eerie smile on her delicate face, which Greem felt was both seductive and cruel. "I don't need a good-for-nothing subordinate. Show me what you are capable of." After announcing this, and without giving him any time to prepare himself, her delicate-looking body swayed, leaving behind a row of after-images. Her real body was mixed in with these after-images, sprinting toward Greem at an incredible speed. She really meant it. This Mary was really a girl of action. Although Mary had been a rather glacial beauty in the past, she still had held the careful and low-profile character of your standard apprentice adept. How did she become so overbearing, arrogant, and aggressive after being let off by Adept Anderson? Unfortunately, Greem had no time to ponder on this anymore, because Mary's attack was fast approaching. A series of rapid warning tones resounded in his brain, nearly making him lose focus. Warning! Warning! High-speed target approaching. Initial evaluation shows the target has the agility which is greater than 13. Host, please move 2 steps to the left. After dodging, counter-attack with a burning hand spell. As the solidification of the fire arrow was still in progress, Greem could only use one spell, Burning Hand. The speed of the attack was extremely fast, and Greem couldn't even see where was the real Mary was. What he could do was to lay all his hope on the guidance given by the chip, move his feet, and step aside, quickly preparing a Burning Hand spell. However, as they say, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Greem clumsily fell to the ground while only halfway through dodging. His shirt was completely torn at the chest, revealing 3 gashes. He struck out with Burning Hand, but his strike hit nothing. Greem pressed his hand against his wounds, distraught at what had just happened. He raised his head and gave Mary an angry look. Meanwhile, Mary was standing leisurely to the side, sticking out her long flexible tongue, and licking the blood from her nails. So it seems you have decent reflexes. But your body is too weak. If this speed is all you have, perhaps you're going to suffer today. Maybe it was because she had tasted blood, but her eyes, which had been completely blue, started to take on a shade of red, making her seem so much more dangerous. If you don't want to die, you better move faster, Tilda. Mary briefly squatted down after she finished speaking, making her look like a leopard preparing to pounce. In the next second, she was rocketing toward him. Damn it, if this went on he really would die. As her eyes began to turn red and her fangs began poked through her lips, warning tones went off like crazy in his brain. Unable to take care of the wounds on his chest, Greem let out a roar. He forcefully slapped both of his palms together. 3 seconds later, 2 massive fireballs erupted from both of his hands, causing Mary to jump back. This is what I'm talking about. He, you better watch out, Tilda. Mary's voice was filled with excitement. She even giggled a bit. In the next second, she leaped forward, turning into a streak of blue. Even with Greem's dynamic vision, he was still only able to see Mary's after images. He was completely unable to find her actual position. Therefore, in order to avoid her getting too close, Greem kept moving his body and adjusting his posture to keep the majority of her after images in front of him. Meanwhile, he was crazily waving his hands, attempting to use the burning flame to block off all the possible paths of attack. Both fireballs were making sizzling noises while Greem was waving them about, pouring sparks of fire all around his body. Unfortunately, it seemed his attempt at defense was pointless. No matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't figure out where she was. Instead, from time to time, he would feel a sudden sharp pain coming from a new place on his body, and all these were making him more and more furious. As the fight progressed, Greem was realizing, more and more, what his weaknesses were. His below-average physique was one of the biggest weaknesses. Even with the help of the mighty chip, he found that he was not as strong as he had originally thought. His agility of 4 defined the speed of his reflexes, movement, and the flexibility of his body. Although the dynamic vision provided by the chip allowed him to roughly guess where Mary was moving, his overly clumsy and slow body was having a hard time keeping up with the guidance of the chip. Therefore, most of the time, even though Greem knew in advance where the attack was coming from, he was unable to defend fast enough. Often when the sharp claws passed his body, his flame was mere inches away, but he still couldn't even touch the tips of the fringes of Mary's dress. Hence, within the huge arena, Grimm was restlessly waving two huge fireballs and doing everything he could to land even the slightest blow on his enemy. However, it seemed he was unable to do anything except receive wounds and groan as the pain from all the wounds added up. As for Mary, she was like a red ghost who drifted from place to place, seeming to blink in and out of reality as she dashed around Grimm. Quite frequently, the dreadful flames almost touched her body, but they were unable to cause her any harm, as she was moving with great speed and agility. Fortunately, Mary was just playfully evaluating Grimm's fighting ability, so all her attacks were only causing minor flesh wounds. If she had been serious, Grimm would have long since been sliced into chunks of meat. But even so, having his body scratched by Mary's blade-like sharp claws, left Grimm with countless scratch marks, and blood all over his body. Although the wounds on his body wouldn't get him killed, they brought Grimm a great deal of anger and humiliation. A month ago, this Mary was only a beginner apprentice, and she was not stronger than him. Because of that damn mutation, caused by magical contamination, she was now able to twist Grimm around her little finger, like he was nothing. This exploding anger was continually suppressed by Grimm, as he knew he was unable to defeat Mary, but he was still doing all he could to chase her flashing red shadow with his raging flame. Inwardly, Grimm's mind was still as calm as a glacier, and he was communicating with the chip without showing any signs externally. Since he couldn't catch Mary with his dynamic vision, he had to find a workaround. Grimm's spirit was draining fast as he kept waving both of his hands restlessly through the air. The dreadful-looking fireballs in his hands were becoming bigger and even more violent. While underneath his eyes, a weird-looking blue dot was blinking dimly, marking an interception point which the chip had vaguely calculated. When Grimm sensed Mary was attacking from his front, he slightly separated his hands, blocked off possible attacks from his left and his right, leaving a half-meter weak point in front of his body. Seeing this, Mary, who planned to attack from the left, simply let out a cold snort, stopped and stood straight, swaying slightly to the side to dodge the flaming red fireball. Not only that, she actually slipped into the slight gap in front of Grimm's chest. What a careless boy, should I leave a mark on your face, or on your chest, Tilda? Mary, who still had time to spare as she lazily fought Grimm, pondered why her instincts had hesitated at this very moment. All of a sudden, her expression changed drastically, and she immediately retreated with an even greater speed than she had attacked with. Even so, her retreating body still couldn't completely escape from the two fireballs that had suddenly changed their courses. Two frightening fireballs came from the left and the right, slamming into each other and exploding, sending sparks of fire in all directions and creating a sea of flames in front of Grimm's body. What happened made Mary cry out in shock. In the time it took to blink, she had moved herself 10 meters away from Grimm, yet she still felt some pain from that attack. She lowered her head and took a look at herself. To her surprise, she found that her red chiffon dress actually been filled with burn marks, as those randomly flying sparks had fallen on her and burned holes in her dress, revealed what was hiding inside. "You bastard, how dare you to damage my dress?" Mary's cold and pretty face became angry. With a cruel glance, she stared straight at Grimm, who was dancing in joy. At this very moment, Grimm was struck with unspeakable excitement, as he was finally able to force Mary back. At last, he found out a weakness in this girl's fighting style. When facing with this kind of high-speed enemy, who fought like an assassin, a weaker spell that covered a wide area was effective in limiting where they could move, while powerful, concentrated spells were unable to even touch them. While immersing himself in the joy of his minor success, Grimm suddenly felt an ominous killing intent. Shocked, he raised his head and saw a girl with a ferocious look on her face. Knowing something bad was going to happen, Grimm quickly tried to explain his actions, but before he could say anything, a red shadow flashed in front of his eyes, grabbed him, and slammed his head against a nearby stone wall. The brutal and violent force of Mary's hand pierced through Grimm's entire body, but, before he could feel the pain, his eyes went black and he fainted. And the last thought that went through his mind was, "What incredible speed!" When Grimm finally regained consciousness, he felt a throbbing pain all over his body, but he also felt a new pain. It seemed he was being dragged by someone. A little, icy cold hand was holding onto his ankle, pulling him across the floor in a face-down manner, which was how he was being brought back to his room. When he finally reached his room, his bare face had been fully covered in blood, which was the result of having his face scraped against the rough floor. Grimm dared not to struggle, as it seems like his last attack had infuriated the moody and petulant Mary. Therefore, all he could do was close his eyes and try his best to endure the pain he felt from all over his body. Fortunately, he could still feel pain. It was better than having been killed while in a coma. Grimm had the chip perform a self-test, and a huge, frightening, red warning sign showed up on top of the report. He only had a total of 11 health points, and he had lost 8 of those. This literally put him death's doorstep. If he lost any more, he would be in trouble. Although that damnable Mary hadn't hurt any of his vitals, and just left a few scratch marks on his body in a playful manner, it was more than enough to reduce his health points to such a pathetic state. This really showed how huge was the gap between them was. A moment later, Mary opened up the wooden door of Grimm's room and threw him inside. After that, her lovely voice said a very cruel thing: "Rest tonight, we'll continue our training in 17 hours. So, it seemed Mary had noticed that Grimm was awake. Grimm raised his head up, shocked that she had known. What he saw was his half-opened wooden door, and the silhouette of the slim, curvy body of a young woman backlit by the candles in the hallway. 17 hours. She expected him to recover in 17 hours. Grimm opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but the wooden door was slammed closed, leaving him in the gloomy darkness of his room. Half an hour later, with a strong will, Grimm finally climbed up from the floor and lit a few candles, so he could take a look at himself. He took off his short, worn-out apprentice robe and found that his skinny body was full of crisscrossing scratch marks and wounds. Although not deep, they were unexpectedly dense. Under the dull candlelight, he began to carefully doctor his wounded body. He had some basic healing medicine in his room. After all, in order to survive in the tower, medicinal paste and poison antidotes were must-have items. Bearing the pain, Grimm applied the medicinal paste to his wounds while grimacing. Immediately, a sensation of tickling that made him crazy came from the wounds, but soon after, it was replaced by a cold sensation that soothed his mind, and the pleasant feeling of having his flesh regenerating followed. Hence Grimm started the slow process of healing. After he finished applying the medicinal paste, Grimm decided to look over the other parts of his self-test report. Surprisingly, the torture he had gone through, just now, had increased all of his attributes, and it even increased his experience by 12. Grimm couldn't help breathing out a long sigh. Did this mean his path to becoming strong was going to be filled with misery? After wallowing in misery and slightly suicidal thoughts, Grimm took a deep breath, then lay down on his bed and started his daily meditation. Once again, he had arrived in the spiritual dimension, which was filled with countless bright specks of light. This time, the light orb representing Grimm's consciousness transformed into a ferocious monster which had hundreds of tentacles from its body. Under Grimm's control, these spiritual tentacles kept poking and swimming around, reaching out and grabbing at all the fire elementum swimming nearby. In the past, Grimm had only passively absorbed the fire elementum that came close enough to him. How could that be compared with his current efficiency, as he was actively absorbing them. With his current speed, one round of meditation would yield 10 times what previous meditation had. It had been a long day for him. So many things had happened and he was too busy to attend to them all. This was the first time he had been able to catch his breath all day and he found himself to be exhausted. Therefore, before he could check the results of his meditation, he fell asleep. At dawn the next day, Greem woke up to the sound of heavy knocking at his door. "Who's that?" "It's me, Tony. It's time." Greem's lips twitched. He realized that 6 days had passed since his last inspection trip, and that it was time for them to do it again. As he was getting up, he quickly glanced at the results of last night's meditation. He was filled with joy as he saw that his spirit had increased from 8.07 to 8.15. A single night of meditation had increased his spirit by 0.08. Didn't that mean that, even if he didn't spend any time studying magic books and just did basic meditation, his spirit would reach the level of advanced apprentice adept in 3 months? This wasn't the only good news. His fire arrow spell would be solidified in 1 hour. In 1 hour, he would become a beginner apprentice who had mastered more than one magic spell. He would no longer be a rookie who could be bullied by anyone. Following the same route as the week before, Greem set out on his inspection trip. Greem quickly noticed that things were quite different today. When he set his foot on the stone-paved path, Greem immediately felt things were wrong. Today, the demons were strangely excited and were behaving in unusual ways. The first stop of his inspection was the grove of ghost trees. Before he even reached the grove, Greem was freaked out by what he saw in front of him. Hundreds of scavenger crows were standing on top of those skinny and wrinkled ghost trees, and every single one of them had their beady red eyes focused on Greem. Oddly enough, none of them were making any noise, which was totally different from how they normally behaved. Honestly, being stared at by a few hundred scavenger crows at the same time would make even the bravest apprentice adept's spine crawl. But what made Greem feel even more baffled was how quiet they were. If they were behaving normally, the noisy calls of the scavenger crows could be heard from a mile away. But today, judging from their quiet manner, it looked like they were all anticipating having a big feast. From the knowledge Greem had in his mind, these scavenger crows would only be so quiet and patient when they were waiting for their food. It was said that these birds could follow a dying traveler for days without sleep or rest, just waiting for the moment when the traveler finally fell. Under the welcoming parade of a few hundred scavenger crows, Greem slowly began walking down the stony trail. As he proceeded, he knew that he was completely surrounded by creatures who came with bad intentions. Chip. Perform a scan the surrounding area. I want to know what is happening here. Greem could no longer stand the oppressing atmosphere and whispered an order to the chip. Beep commencing real-time scanning task, establishing dynamic monitoring for surrounding area, beep beep. Source of disturbance is unknown smell. Direction, southeast. Distance, 500 meters. Unknown smell. After noting the chip's report, Greem took a deep breath and tried to smell this unknown smell. After a moment, he was able to sense the mild smell of blood mixed with the rotten smell of the fog. No wonder all these demons looked so excited today. If he was able to smell the scent of blood, of course these creatures, who had tens or even hundreds of times more sensitive senses, could smell it. However, today was not the monthly open day, when the tower would purposely lower the swamp's defenses to entice outsiders to come and feed the wildlife. Could it be someone had really sneaked into this place? With questions filling his mind, Greem poured an entire bottle of Allen grass potion into his mouth, pulled up his hood, and started running towards the southeast. An Allen grass potion was a special magic potion decocted from Allen grass. It was able to close every single pore on a human's body, suppressing the drinker's body odors. But it only lasted for 30 minutes. In the Garden of Whispers. The garden, which was usually dead silent and completely empty of life, had turned into a terrifying battleground. As he approached the site, he could hear the horrible screams of demon babies and the cries of wandering souls. He also heard loud human voices, cursing with rage and fright. Apparently, this was the source of the pungent smell of blood that had attracted his attention. Using the trees and grass as cover, Grimm slowly moved closer to the battlefield. Soon, he found a place with a good view, which allowed him to watch what was happening. There were two groups fighting at the scene. The attackers were, of course, the horrible demon babies and the other wandering souls who lived here. Then there were 17 mercenaries struggling to hold off the horrifying creatures in front of them. It seemed to be a group of skillful and experienced mercenaries. They looked strong and vigorous, and were not lacking in physical strength or courage. Also, their equipment was pretty good. They had large thick shields made from solid wood, arm and shoulder guards, and each of them had a bow with them. This made them capable of hunting many of the ordinary demons in this swamp. But, unfortunately for them, the demons who surrounded them were some of the most frightening creatures within the swamp, demon babies. Demon baby had no legs, and crawled across the ground with a pair of sharp claws, dragging a long organ, which looked like an umbilical cord, behind them. They were ugly and had twisted bodies, yet looked remarkably similar to human infants. However, their faces were not made of smooth youthful flesh, but of wrinkled dead skin, and their facial features were squeezed together, giving them extremely ugly faces. Within the knee-deep bushes, these small demons were crawling back and forth, letting out curses and screams that echoed throughout the area. Whenever a baby's cry was heard, it would immediately cause those human mercenaries to yell in fright. Although these demon babies had small bodies, each of them had a strength of at least 5, which equaled that of your average adult human. Not only that, but they also had a pair of deadly claws. Whenever they leaped forward and struck the large wooden shields, they would leave deep scratch marks behind. However, their deadliest weapon was their curse. When Grimm arrived, these demon babies were trying to break through the defensive shields with their bodies. One after the other, the demon babies rushed through the bushes, launching themselves into the air and trying to land behind the defensive shields of those mercenaries, but every time, those mercenaries, who were prepared, would knock them back with their arm guards. There was even a demon baby who couldn't escape in time, and found themselves nailed to the ground with an arrow. Although it had its body nailed to the ground, the demon baby was still very fierce, crazily digging the dirt with its claws. Then it raised its body and let out an irritating baby cry toward a closest human mercenary. The cry was sharp and ear-splitting, but while it was just an unpleasant noise for other people, but when the cry hit the mercenary who was standing closest to it, it instantly struck him with the frightening curse. The muscular mercenary suddenly threw away his shield and placed both of his hands tightly against his ear, screaming out, "Help me! I can't see anything." Right after he screamed, tears of blood spilled from his tightly closed eyes, terrifying the rest of the mercenaries. Before anyone could do anything, another 2 demon babies dashed out from the bushes, ferocious smiles on their ugly faces. They opened up their mouths and screamed at the mercenary who had been previously struck by blind. Blind plus insanity plus confuse. Even an official apprentice adept would have a hard time in defending against a demon baby's curse, let alone these mercenaries, who were only ordinary humans. Before his fellow mercenaries could knock him out, this mercenary crazily pushed away everything around him and rushed out of the defensive formation. "No, Bazar, come back. A middle-aged man, who looked like the leader of the group, immediately shouted from within the formation. But it was too late. If someone could have looked down from above, he would have seen some crazy movements within the bushes around this team of mercenaries, as many fast-moving grass lines shot toward the mercenary who was fleeing in confusion. Bazar. A bold-looking man threw away his own shield, grabbed an axe, and started charging out to rescue his friend. However, he was forcefully pulled back by his leader. Don't go, Tark. It is too late now. The leader grabbed the bold-looking man's arm while gazing helplessly after the departing man. As if proving his words, Bazar, who was running amok, got pushed down by a swarm of demon babies. His pain-filled and shrill screaming only lasted for a few more seconds before coming to a complete stop. Then all that could be heard was the noise of those demon babies tearing into his flesh and munching on his bones. Although it was half covered by the knee-deep bushes, no mercenary could stand to witness the scene of those demon babies feasting on their friend. Just by looking at the constant moving dried grass and listening to the terrifying and eerie noises, it was still enough for them to envision the extremely dreadful scene that must be happening in those bushes. Therefore, their long-standing determination and morale began to fall. Suddenly, a human head-sized fireball shot out from the center of the mercenaries, creating a long trail of dark smoke. It fell right into the center of the area where those demon babies were happily feasting. In next second, together with a deafening explosion, the terrifying fire elementum expanded and turning everything in an area of 10 meters into a raging sea of flames. With just this one single strike, more than 20 demon babies were killed. 14 of them, who were at the center of the explosion, had been turned into ashes in an instant. Those who at the edges of the explosion were all injured by the raging flames. For a moment, the shrill cries of demon babies reverberated through the skies. A fire spell. Greem, who was watching from the dark, was startled for a moment. He quickly looked around, soon finding 3 suspicious targets, who were standing in the center of the mercenaries. They were all dressed relatively similarly to himself. Their black cloaks and hoods completely covered their bodies so that not even an inch of their skin was exposed, but, judging from the size of their bodies, he supposed that they were 2 men and a girl. 3 apprentice adepts who had left their nest for experience. As he couldn't directly see them, there was no way for Greem to obtain the specific attributes of these people. Hence, he didn't dare act recklessly. He quietly took out his magical talisman and reported what was happening here to the Adept Tower. During this period of time, the demon babies, who had suffered great losses, actually called upon all the wandering souls to aid them. As these wandering souls were capable of living among other demons, of course they were not low-ranked creatures, like those zombies or skeletons, but, rather, were actually a conscious body that was formed from strong resentment and evil intentions. Although they had human forms, they didn't have physical bodies, and their innate ability to freely shift between the ethereal and the physical allowed them to ignore most physical attacks and defenses. Their bodies looked like blurry shadows. Comparatively, their heads were much clearer, and they had facial features similar to that of a human. They had a pair of arms with sharp claws, yet where their legs should be was just a vague shadow. If looking from afar, it was like their legs had merged into the air. When this group of wandering souls dashed out from the woods, the entire place was immediately filled with the eerie cries of ghosts, which could make one's soul shiver. The temperature also significantly dropped. When attacked by this, seemingly endless, group of frightening wandering souls, the mercenaries' defensive formation immediately collapsed. The wandering souls, who had shifted their bodies into their ethereal forms, jumped into the group of men without fear, as they could totally ignore the weapons and shield held by those mercenaries. With their icy cold ghost claws, these wandering souls were busy leaving deadly scratch marks on their targets' bodies. There were even some wandering souls squeezed themselves into the bodies of the mercenaries, taking control over their bodies and launching attacks against the other mercenaries. Now that a breach had been created by the Wander Souls, the evil demon babies, again, joined the battle, using their horrifying curses to destroy the wills of these mercenaries. After that, they dragged the cursed bodies into bushes and started feasting on them. The scene had become even more chaotic and bloody. As they looked out and saw the massive crowd of demons and wandering souls overwhelming the mercenaries around them, the 3 apprentice adepts were, finally, forced to remove their cloaks and join the battle, revealing their faces to the world. The leader of the 3 was a muscular young man. He had a head of disheveled gold hair that hung down to his shoulders. Just under his hair, a mysterious circlet adorned his forehead. It was clearly not an ordinary item. He was wearing a delicately made leather jacket and carrying a broadsword on his back. Judging from the size of the sword, it would weigh too much for the average man to even swing it. The other man was dressed like nobility. The delicate and luxurious clothes on his body were quite impressive, but what was even more impressive was his head. He had dark green skin, a long narrow mouth, and a thin tongue that kept flicking in and out. He, unexpectedly, had the head of a snake. Meanwhile, a little girl stood in between these 2 men. She had a face like an angel and was wearing a long light yellow dress. She was of average height and was holding a gold-colored birdcage in her hands. Strangely enough, not only she did not show any sign of fear towards the bloody scene in front, but she was actually glancing around with a cute smile on her face, which made her simply look like a curious young girl. Grimm's eyes suddenly went wide. Via his Elementum vision, he saw very bright glowing Elementum, and spiritual ripples that looked like tidal waves, coming from all 3 apprentice adepts. By the chip's evaluation, these 3 were either pseudo-adepts or elites among the advanced apprentice adepts. No matter who they were not something Grimm, a beginner apprentice adept, could ever think of handling. Why had such strong people come here like this? This place was the private property of Master Anderson, and a resources site of the Sarubo family. With the exception of the annual resource shipment, this place was not open to outsiders. All of this made Grimm really curious about the motives of these foreign apprentice adepts. But, after witnessing their immense abilities, Grimm's curiosity instantly died, leaving him completely alert, and feeling a little fear. The human mercenaries were capable of dealing with demon beasts, but once they were faced with demon babies, wandering souls, and other similar demons, they were like sheep being led to the slaughter. When the simple defensive shield was broken, the swarm of demons began to massacre the mercenaries. Demon babies were jumping and leaping all over the place, crying out terrifying curses to reduce their prey's fighting abilities. Using the bushes as cover, these monsters launched sneak attacks and knocked the mercenaries to the ground. Thus, it was a scene filled with mercenaries in the throes of death. Also, those dreadful wandering souls were circling around in mid-air, seeking chances to pull a mercenary into the skies. When that happened, the other demons would storm in and rip the helpless prey to pieces. Right in the middle of this chaotic scene, a wandering soul, who had an ugly and twisted face, dove down from the air, targeting those 3 casual and strange-looking apprentice adepts. Before the lead man and the little girl could do anything, the snake-headed struck. Striking with great force, a pale green-looking poison, shaped into an arrow, instantly penetrated the wandering soul's body, immediately exploding. The intense corrosive poison melted the resentment core hidden inside of its body, turning it into a pile of ashes with a horrifying and painful-sounding scream. Grimm noticed that the poison arrow wasn't created with normal spellcasting, but was launched from the mouth of that snakehead apprentice. And that attack was just the beginning. The apprentice didn't stop what he had started, and opened his mouth widely, continuously spitting out poison arrows. With each strike, he accurately eliminated one of the horrifying wandering souls, which were rated as possessing the power of an intermediate apprentice. Bloodline Adept. He was definitely one of those bloodline adepts that the basic adept book had mentioned. Within the vast and complicated development hierarchy of the adept world, there were 4 branches that stood out: bloodline adepts, body refining adepts, principal adepts, and profound adepts. It could be said that most of the other adept branches were matched up to these 4 major branches. Bloodline adepts were a bunch of lunatics who craved having the purest bloodlines. They used the power of said bloodlines to improve their own strength. Usually, they would choose some incredibly strong creatures from another world as the source for their bloodline, then they would improve the purity of their own blood, generally using a method which could be traced back to some ancestor. After doing all of this, they would gain incredible abilities that aligned with that of ancient powerful creatures. In general, their ultimate goal was to relive the glorious life of these ancient creatures. As for body refining adepts, they were another group of lunatics who went all out in the pursuit of strengthening their own bodies. In their eyes, all resources were just a medium, a consumable supply that could be used to make their muscles stronger. In order to stimulate their muscles, they might soak themselves in a container full of poisonous chemicals, or implant a deadly, highly radioactive meteorite into their body. They might go out and endure the most extreme and deadly environments, and they would do all of these to make their bodies strong so that nothing could hurt them. In all honesty, principal adepts were the most common type of adept in the adept world. No matter it was the elementum adept, who chased after the peak powers of their elements, the curse adept, who used strange abilities to kill people unseen, or even the black adept, who just enjoyed using violent killing abilities, usually utilizing the force of souls and emotion, all of them belonged to the branch of principal adepts. Although it seemed that there was a tremendous difference in what they did, when they arrived at the advanced stage, they would try their best to master specific principles or rules of the universe. They were the people who grew by mastering elemental laws principles. As for profound adept, they were the purest type of adepts. They were not willing to contaminate their own bloodline just to obtain powerful ability, and they refused to coupled with principles of planes and became the slaves of principles. They gathered knowledge, immersed themselves in the world of knowledge, and used the knowledge they learned as their weapon. Thus, they became a weird group among adepts, who only cared about gathering and expanding their knowledge, but totally ignored their own development. With these 4 major branches as the backbone, an infinite variety of strange adepts were born into this world. They conquered different worlds, looting resources and knowledge, and enslaving thousands of planes. They were the dominating force of the entire adept world when fighting, or conquering, other worlds. This was the information regarding the adept hierarchy which Grimm had obtained after the chip spent time gathering and organizing the mass of raw data he had input into it. As he only knew a handful of people, the data he gathered was not complete, and there was, probably, a huge discrepancy in it. Although he only had this small amount simple information, it drew the outline of the massive and ferocious adept world he was now a part of. If he hadn't known of these branches, he wouldn't have been able to correctly guess the details of that snakehead apprentice a second ago. But, right as Grimm was guessing which species of snake the snakehead apprentice had inherited a bloodline from, something even more surprising happened. The cute little girl joined the fight. A demon baby, who was quickly moving across the ground, had placed its eyes on these 3 people, setting them as its target and dashing in their direction. At the same time, it kept letting out irritating cries from its mouth, which was twisted and full of sharp yellow teeth, launching its curse attacks at the 3 of them. No doubt, its behavior had provoked the little girl. However, not only did her immature face not show any signs of anger. Instead, it bloomed with a sweet smile. She raised up the birdcage in her hands, which looked like a toy, pointed it toward the demon baby, and shook it a few times. Though not a single sound was heard, lights and shadows flickered, and the demon baby, who had previously been dashing toward them, disappeared from where it was. At the same time, Grimm, who had sharp vision, noticed that a miniature demon baby had appeared inside of the birdcage the little girl carried. It was only the size of a human hand, and looked exactly the same as the demon baby who had just disappeared. Obviously, this demon baby had no idea what had caused its sudden transformation. After being stunned for a second, it became extremely fierce and let out a jarring cry toward the little girl outside of the cage, repeatedly slamming the cage with its body. But, no matter how hard it tried, there was no way it could escape from that simple-looking birdcage. Space magic. Grimm placed a hand tightly over his mouth to prevent himself from screaming out loud. Out of the many principal magics, although every principle would bring an astonishing power at the ultimate level, if someone really wanted to define their ranking, the principles of time and space magic were among the very top. But, according to Grimm's knowledge, these two top-level magic branches were among the weakest of all the branches in the adept world. This was simply because these two magic branches could only depend on one's innate talent. Even the most powerful adept, who could destroy a world with the wave of his hand, could never make time stop for 1 second. However, some people were born with this ability, and, although they might not learn any knowledge related to magic, they could still achieve something that even the best adepts couldn't. And yet, just because these magics were so bizarre and unpredictable and could only be used by someone who had the talent, those adepts who didn't possess such talent, no matter how much of a genius they were, it would be impossible for them to come out with great results through experimentation. Therefore, without a huge and solid foundation, it was really tough for those who focused on the time and space magic branches to produce top-tier adepts. Grimm was having issues deciding whether this was the little girl's innate ability, or some bizarre magical item that allowed her to catch any enemy, regardless of distance. Although Grimm thought he had a deep understanding of this bizarre world of advanced magic, right at this very moment, he had to admit one thing: the real world of adepts was much more crazy and bizarre than his wildest dreams and nightmares. These three outsiders were either pseudo-adepts or elites among advanced apprentice adepts. If Grimm was forced to fight them while only having access to his 2 low-rank spells, he would probably die. For this reason, he didn't dare continue watching anymore. He turned around, followed the trail, and quietly returned to the Adept Tower. When he arrived at the main door of the tower, the newly appointed apprentice leader, Ellen, was here along with the 3 strongest, Hawkeye, Evil Bugs, and Madwoman. Grimm threw a puzzled glance at Ellen, but soon realized why they were here. The warning he sent via the magic talisman could only be received by a special magical item, which was currently held in Ellen's hand. When Ellen heard there were 3 powerful apprentice adepts in the magical swamp, he knew that, with his abilities, there was no way he could chase off or capture these outsiders. Therefore, before Grimm had returned, Ellen had asked the 3 strongest for help. It, obviously, cost him something in order to obtain help from the 3 strongest, but only he knew what that cost was. Recalling to what he witnessed just now, Grimm didn't have too much confidence in the strongest 3. No matter how he compared them, those 3 outsiders were stronger than them. Perhaps Ellen was wishfully thinking he could capture all of them. In less than 10 minutes, the mercenary group, which had been employed by the 3 apprentice adepts, had almost been entirely wiped out. The last 4 of them were covered from head to toe with blood. They were standing back to back, barely able to defend themselves against the attacks of the surrounding demons. On the other side, their employers, the three apprentice adepts, were casually standing there and watching the mercenaries get killed with a cold indifference. Unless they were attacked by the demons, they didn't interfere the battle between the demons and the mercenaries. It was as if the deaths of these mercenaries meant nothing to them. As the last four mercenaries were fighting for their lives, the three apprentice adepts were leisurely chatting with each other. The elementum aura we sensed just now should have belonged to one of the local apprentices. Why didn't you let me capture them? The cute and chubby-faced girl grumbled at her large muscular companion. What's the point of capturing him? The man shook his head and continued, clearly this place has a well-built magical formation. We have been roaming around here for 3 days and are still unable to find the way to enter it. Without one of them leading us there, I'm afraid we wouldn't be able to find the Adept Tower even if we spent another 3 days searching. That's exactly why we should have captured him. The little girl spoke furiously. Perhaps due to the fact that her opinion was not accepted, she began to release her anger onto the creature she had captured in the birdcage. As she muttered something under her breath, the internal space within the birdcage began to squeeze in on itself, shrinking. The compression of the space soon reached the body of the demon baby, and some cracking noises started to issue from its body. Hearing the sharp and pain-filled cries coming from the demon baby, the smile on this little girl's face became filled with joy. When the poor little demon baby finally imploded and crumpled into a pile of meat paste, little girl immediately waved her arms in the air and stamped her feet in joy, a look of extreme excitement covering her little face. Seeing that the little girl had relieved her anger on her toy, the other two apprentice adepts breathed out sighs of relief. The snake-headed apprentice shook his head and moved closer to the muscular leader, asking, "You saw it was all right to let that scout get away? I'm sure he'll bring more guards here." "Guards?" The muscular leader laughed grimly. "This swamp is just an ordinary resource site. Do you think the Sarubo family would really be willing to waste an official adept to guard it? In my opinion, with the exception of Adept Anderson, all that's left in this place are apprentice adepts. You really think we should be afraid of the apprentice adepts we are likely to find in this place?" Snakehead Apprentice laughed hideously, his forked tongue flicking in and out through his lips, creating a gruesome-sounding hiss. "This place does have quite a lot of rare materials that I need. In any case, it'll take a while before those guards get here. I think I'll just do a little sightseeing while I wait." After saying that, the snake-headed apprentice simply walked toward another swampy area in the distance. Something really strange was occurring. Although the stony trail was not that far away from him, he didn't notice it and walked right past. This was, in fact, one of the many defensive mechanisms of the Adept Tower. Only those internal apprentice adepts, who wore a magical talisman, could see the stony trail, while, in the eyes of any outsider, the trail was just another part of the swamp, no different in any way. Watching as one of his partners disappeared into the fog, the muscular leader hesitated for a moment, then he just turned around and walked off in another direction. It was a rare opportunity to be in the private resource site of an adept family. If he didn't get himself something good before he finished his official business here, that would be quite a waste. As for that bizarre little girl, either intentionally or unintentionally, they left her in the middle of those violent and bloody demons. Would she be hurt? This question never crossed the minds of these two male apprentices. Honestly, perhaps the biggest and most brutal demon in this swampy land was the little girl. Therefore, when Green brought Ellen and the strongest three here, what they saw in front of them was a cute little girl with a golden birdcage, standing right in the middle of a crowd of blood-covered demons. At this moment, there was not a single member of the entire mercenary company that had not been torn into chunks of meats and scattered all over the place. While their broken corpses were being pulled apart by an army of demon babies, the little girl was standing right in the center of these demons. Oddly enough, no demons dared to get within 10 steps of this little girl. Not only that, but when the little girl bounced and skipped from place to place, those demon babies, who were busy eating, would roar at her in anger, then they would move aside and make way for her, not daring to really get in her way. A mercenary, who had bloody stumps for legs and a single broken arm, was being gnawed on by dozens of demon babies. Barely alive, he raised his bloody and broken arm, waving toward the little girl, who was approaching him, and said, "Save me, save me." With a sweet smile on her face, the little girl squatted in front of him and asked, in a soft voice, "I can save your soul from these demons. Are you willing to let me save your soul?" The dying mercenary was surprised to hear that and immediately nodded his head. However, he didn't notice that the girl had said the word "save" in a vague and weird tone. If he had known the other languages the girl knew, he would have found out that when these weird tones fit together, she had actually said a word meaning "consume," which was from the ancient Andes language in the Adept continent. After obtaining the approval of this mercenary, the smile on little girl's face became even sweeter. She swiftly took out a milky white crystal ball from her pocket and placed it against the mercenary's forehead. With a short and simple spell, the mercenary's body trembled, and then the tiny flame of hope, which had just appeared in his eyes, died off. A white shadow came out from his forehead and disappeared into the crystal ball. The life force of the mercenary evaporated, and his bloody arm collapsed to the ground, never to rise again. The apprentices of the tower had watched this all happen and were standing there, appalled at what they had just seen. Their arrival had attracted the little girl's attention. She walked straight up to Grimm's group, raised her head, and gently asked, "Hi. I'm the adorable Alice. Are you guys from around here?" Grimm and the others glared at this little Lolita, who seemed to be trying to make herself familiar with them, and didn't get deceived by her disguise. Within the population of apprentice adepts, friendship, love, and humanity were all just beautiful words that had long since been thrown away. All that was left inside them was the desire for knowledge, resources, and power. Those apprentices who were naive would die before ever reaching intermediate apprentice. The thought of such a person reaching the level of advanced apprentices was simply too impossible to even be conceived. Noticing that they were eyeing her crystal ball and birdcage, Alice quickly hid both of them behind her, quirking her lips and saying, "All of these things belong to Alice. You wouldn't think of taking them away from me, would you?" Ellen looked all over the place, then sternly whispered to Grimm, "I thought you said that there were 3 apprentice adepts. Where are the other 2? Kerry went that way. He's a big guy, and good at fighting. If he meets with this big sister, I'm sure something lively will happen." The little girl pointed her finger to the east and spoke in an innocent manner. Clearly, she was referring to Madwoman, who was also carrying a huge sword on her back. Jeffrey went that way. I think he said he wanted to look for some materials. What she said shocked the 5 of them, and their eyes took on ghastly looks. No matter how many demons were killed, none of them would feel even the slightest bit of pity about it, but if those secret medicine plantations and gardens were found by these outsiders, perhaps all the apprentices of the tower would be punished by Adept Anderson. Madwoman's loud, braying voice instantly exploded. "I'll go that way and stop that guy." After saying that, Madwoman's bulky body started sprinting toward the east. As she ran, she crushed the few demon babies who got in her way under her feet, making others screaming angrily, though none dared to move closer to her. "I'll go this way," Hawkeye said coolly, pulling up his cap and dashing towards the west. For some unknown reasons, the calls of scavenger crows were heard from the sky, though they were hidden by the thick fog. The noise immediately followed behind Hawkeye's. Apprentice leader Ellen rolled his eyes and murmured, "I'll go and help him." After saying that, he simply followed behind Hawkeyes and left. In the end, only Evil Bugs, Greem, and the strange, unpredictable little girl were left at the scene. "Are you going to fight me?" The little girl tilted her head and stared at the remaining two men. "Before we fight, don't you guys want to know where we came from? There is no reason to ask you anything. You have caused mayhem here, and you shall be punished for it. If I capture you, you'll have to tell me everything. If I can't defeat you, I'll bear all the losses here. Now, show me what you can do." It was rather rare to hear Evil Bugs say so much. But, right as he finished speaking, the black soil underneath the little girl's feet exploded, and a huge amount of black scorpions burst from the ground. Each of these scorpions was the size of a human palm, had a pure black body and a pair of claws, and on their backs was a tail with a poison needle. The stinking smell of poison filled the air near these scorpions. Although there was a distance of 20 meters between them, it was impossible to tell when Evil Bugs had sent these scorpions out, sneaking their way underground to hide near the little girl. This little girl shouldn't have a strong physique. Thus, as long as she was poisoned, she should quickly lose the ability to cast any of her bizarre spells. Before they had come here, Greem had emphasized the strange abilities of this little girl, therefore, Evil Bugs had no plans of experiencing it himself. He just wanted to knock her out as quick as possible. But what happened probably made Evil Bugs' mouth drop. An invisible barrier was created between the little girl's feet and those scorpions. No matter how they slammed into it or pricked it with their tails, there was no way they could get past it. Slowly, when more and more scorpions gathered together, a wall of bugs was built up against the invisible wall. One after another, scorpions stacked on top of each other, crazily attacked the invisible barrier in front of them, but, no matter how they tried, they just couldn't break through it. Protection barrier. Evil Bugs kept repeating this phrase in a hoarse voice, as he was struck dumb with amazement by what he saw in front of his eyes. Protection barrier was a spell which could divide space and was considered one of the sturdiest shields in the world. Even an official adept would have a hard time breaking through this paper-thin barrier. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Evil Bugs lost control and let out an angry roar. "Your barrier must be fake. Else that would mean you are as strong as an adept. March, my children. Use your numbers and overwhelm our enemies' defenses." Under the control of Evil Bugs, thousands of scorpions immediately burst out from underneath his cloak, forming into scorpion armies that marched toward the little girl who was standing in front of them. At the same time, Evil Bugs opened up his mouth, spitting out countless flies, which looked like clumps of dark clouds, quickly blotting out the sky and the land as they flew towards the little girl. No beginner apprentice could interfere in a battle between two advanced apprentices. So, from the time the battle began, Greem had been slowly backing away, doing his best to get out of the way, so as not to get hit with a wayward spell. Judging from the current situation, Evil Bugs had established a dominant position, as the little girl was trapped under a mound of his scorpions. As soon as he could find a way past the protection barrier, this battle would be over. Unfortunately for Evil Bugs, the situation was overturned in the next second by a seemingly unintentional counterattack from the little girl. The little girl, who was seemingly trapped by countless scorpion, still wore the same sweet smile on her face, as if she had nothing to fear from those crawling scorpions around her. Looking Evil Bugs through the rising wall of scorpions, she raised the birdcage in her hand and shook it in Evil Bugs' direction. At this moment, Evil Bugs felt his heart go cold. Greem had told him about how bizarre was this little girl was, so Evil Bugs had been paying extra attention to any movements the girl made. When he saw little girl shake the cage, Although he didn't notice any attacks falling on his body, Evil Bugs still dodged to one side as fast as he could. A pained cry came from Evil Bug's mouth. His body had, indeed, moved away from where he had previously stood, but, for some reason, he nearly fell down after dodging movement. Then he noticed that his right leg had mysteriously disappeared. In next second, his missing right leg appeared in the birdcage, looked extremely tiny. The little girl stared at him in astonishment. She never expected that her enemy would be able to dodge so fast. Before the enemy could do anything to his limb, Evil Bugs let out a furious cry, causing the tiny leg trapped in the birdcage to explode into countless scorpions. The scorpions transformed into a thread of dark smoke and disappeared. At the same time, his black robe started to ripple and flow. This was caused by the movement of scorpions, which had started to cling to each other to form a brand new leg. Biological modification. For the first time, the little girl's smile disappeared. Her grim-looking little face had a somber expression that didn't match her appearance. What a surprise, so you have given up your human body and modified yourself to be entirely made of bugs. Don't assume you can be immortal like this. I, Alice, will let you taste real terror today. After that, the little girl stretched her cute little hands and performed a grabbing gesture toward Evil Bugs. In next second, Evil Bug let out an angry roar, pressed his hand against his chest, and staggered back, almost falling to the ground. At the same time, out of nowhere, a beating heart appeared in the little girl's hand. If it was any other person, perhaps this would have killed them. But, obviously, Evil Bugs had gone through thorough body modifications and had gotten rid of several organs which were vital for normal human beings. When he saw his heart had been stolen by the little girl, he simply let out a shrill cry. Following this cry, just like his right leg, the heart in little girl's hand exploded into countless scorpions, quickly turning to ash. It seems you were quite thorough with your modifications. The little girl spoke savagely. With a reedy, grating voice, she continued, I don't believe you have replaced all of your organs. I'll definitely find the core that maintains your bug-infested body. Finished speaking, the little girl began to recklessly attack with both hands, continually grabbing at Evil Bug's body. Although some of her attacks were dodged, under her continuous attacks, she would still successfully hit her target every few attacks. And whenever she succeeded, some weird object would appear in her palms. Bloodily, sloppy, and sticky, no one would be able to identify where these organs came from in his body. But no matter what kind of organs appeared in little girl's palm, in the end, they always exploded into scorpions and then faded to ashes. While she was happily pulling his organs out, Evil Bugs was filled with a raging inferno of anger. While moving at high speed and continuously dodging the bizarre, mysterious, long-ranged attacks from the enemy, Evil Bugs kept attacking little girl with his scorpions. However, no matter how carefully he tried, he still couldn't completely dodge the bizarre spell attacks, which gave no warning and put off no elementum ripples. At the same time, when faced with the indestructible protection barrier, he actually felt a sense of helplessness, as he couldn't find the opportunity to attack the little girl. If this kept going on, even if he had a high confidence on his own modified bug's body, perhaps he would have to admit defeat to this little girl. Right when the thought of retreating was growing in Evil Bug's mind, Greem suddenly shouted out to him. Sir Evil Bugs, attack the back of her head. Attack the back of her head. Evil Bugs groaned in his mind. He had already tried the back of her head. In fact, he had tried attacking from all possible angles and positions, even from underground. But no matter what he did, the paper-think protection barrier had dissolved all of his attacks. No matter how he tried, he just couldn't find any weak spots in her invisible protection barrier. But something surprised him, as when Grimm's shout was heard by Alice, she unconsciously turned rigid for a second. At the same time, her pair of big, purple eyes glared at Grimm, who was hiding in a far distance, and she started secretly gnashing her teeth in anger. Although no much emotions could be seen on Alice's rigid face, Evil Bugs still noticed a small bit of panic in her eyes. Could that really be her weak spot? Though he was still skeptical about what Grimm had said, Evil Bug's heart was filled with anger, as he had most of his internal organs plucked out by this little girl. Hence, without giving it a second thought, he initiated a close-ranged attack. Without making any noise, Evil Bug's body collapsed. His black cloak fell to the ground after losing its support, revealed nothing but emptiness underneath it. At the same time, a dark figure suddenly appeared at Alice's back. It was a dark figure completely formed from countless scorpions, an amorphous bug body which had been assembled into a human form. A face could be barely seen on the head of this figure. Right after it stood up, the humanoid figure immediately leaped forward, pressing its body into the invisible barrier that he had been having a hard time in breaking through. In the next instant, the scorpions around them turned into a black tidal wave, crazily slamming themselves against the regions behind Alice's head. Somehow, a fist-size ripple finally appeared on the protection barrier, right at the position where all those scorpions were slamming into. In fact, that region was not a protection barrier, but a mini-size air barrier, which had perfectly connected with the protection barrier. Evil Bugs instantly widened his eyes, and his heart was filled with an unspeakably wild joy. Indeed, there was a flaw in the enemy's defense, and the flaw was this air barrier. Although they were both barriers, there was a vast difference between their magical characteristics. Protection Barrier was a space-type spell, the top principle among all Adept principles. It was also referred to as the strongest defense within the planes. On the other side, Air Barrier was formed from a variant usage of Wind Elementum. If no one spotted this weakness, perhaps it would be extremely difficult for anyone to discover this small backdoor that was hidden in the Protection Barrier. But when Evil Bugs used all his effort and hit on this particular spot, the only unstable part of the Protection Barrier instantly exploded. After a heart-stirringly loud crash, the Scorpion army broke the mirror and swarmed into the Protection Barrier like a black tidal wave. In an instant, the small cute body of Alice had been covered by the rolling and creeping tide of scorpions. Unexpectedly, a sharp grating cry resounded throughout the scene, and a ground-shaking explosion suddenly rippled from within the Scorpion army, which had piled up like a small black hill of scorpions. Broken pieces of black scorpions flew in all directions, as terrifying-looking cracks of space stretched out in a spider web pattern. Whenever a scorpion touched by these space cracks, its body part would immediately disintegrate without making any sound. No matter how thick their shell was, none could escape from the devastating attack. This perfectly showed the matchless ability of space spells. A raging shockwave repelled all the scorpions that had piled up on her body. Then the space cracks swept the area, violently crushing and disintegrating any scorpions which got in their path, revealing Alice's small form within the mound of bugs. Right in the center of suddenly the web of space cracks, Alice was floating in mid-air, her long waving hair flowing out from her head. She let out a terrifying and extremely angry roar into the sky. Using space as her weapon, disintegrated all the scorpions around her. Once this little girl, who possessed a great innate talent of space, became angry, she was capable of launching such terrifying and deadly attacks. This made Grimm, who was hiding a few hundred meters away, feel his heart tremble with fright. Was the gap between beginner apprentice and advanced apprentice this huge? Although he kept reminding himself that this Alice belonged to the top tier of advanced apprentices, he couldn't hold down the fear and shock growing in his heart. This group of people was simply too powerful. Even though they were still not official adepts, or even pseudo-adepts, they possessed terrifying abilities which were beyond belief. With just one single terrifying attack, Alice had covered a huge 50-meter area with a 360 degrees destructive spell that no one could escape. Within this area, space shattered as the deadly space cracks swept across nearly every inch of the region. When faced with the devastating space cracks, which could shear through anything, Elementum Resistant was simply a joke. No apprentice-level personal protection spell would provide any protection against the destruction caused by the space cracks. Without any unique life-saving abilities, even if 10 pseudo-adepts tried to resist Alice's attack together, they would all probably die. At this moment, Grimm really felt a bit of pity for Evil Bugs, as he had been right in the center of that area, hence he had probably been killed. Also, Grimm would have to immediately run for his life if Evil Bugs was dead. Right when Grimm was about to give up on Evil Bugs, his eyes suddenly saw something near the battlefield. Dirt was being pushed up at that place, revealed a big hole underneath. A swarm of black scorpions burst out from it, quickly forming together and becoming Evil Bugs. Fortunately, Evil Bugs was still alive. But, just as a wild joy had begun to surge up in Grimm's mind, he forced himself to push it back down. Something was not right. It seemed that this Evil Bugs had really suffered from that destructive space spell. At this moment, Evil Bugs had lost all his arrogance and high spirits, which he shown at the beginning of the fight. The army of thousands of horrifying scorpions had shrunk to a mere 100, which was barely enough to form up his body. The newly formed body was shorter than before, and his Elementum aura could hardly be sensed, clearly showing that he had lost much in that last clash. On the other side, Alice, who had just lashed out with that deadly attack, had lost her calm and indifferent attitude as well. Although those scorpions had only been able to attack her body for a few seconds, but during that short period of time, she had been fully covered by more than 1,000 scorpions, crawling and biting on every inch of her skin. It simply made her rage with extreme anger. As her floating body returned to the ground, Grimm finally saw how miserable her appearance had become. The cute little Lolita had disappeared. The right side of Alice's eye had turned into a huge and bloody hole, with blood dripping down on her silky smooth skin. The dreadful poison of scorpion had made numerous black and purple patches all over her body. All of that together with her nearly insane and eerie grin. She looked like she was about to go berserk. Run! Grimm was no idiot. When he saw Alice was staring straight at him with her remaining evil-looking eye, without giving it a second thought, he turned and ran away. With his ability, there was no way he could fight this Alice. Also, Evil Bugs was half crippled and had no way to stop this Lolita who was about to rampage. Therefore, without saying anything, Grimm fled the scene. Initially, Actaeon was waiting, hoping the scorpion poison would be able to kill this formidable Lolita. But when he saw the enemy slowly turn her remaining eye toward him, he immediately dispersed his scorpion body, transforming back into a swarm of scorpions and squeezing underground, disappearing without a trace. Soon, a furious little girl was the only one left at the scene. The rampage started. She floated up into the air, and began to soar like a bird, flying in the direction that Grimm had run, and quickly disappeared into the thick fog. When everything had been quiet for a moment, the dirt under a skinny killer tree was pushed up, revealing Evil Bugs, who had been hiding while waiting for the little girl to leave. He looked off towards where Alice had disappeared and hesitated for a moment, but, in the end, he just couldn't gather his courage to chase after the terrifying girl. Although that little Lolita was badly injured as well, she still looked like she had energy spare. He just didn't have the confidence to face such a frightening enemy again. After a long moment, he clenched his teeth, turned around, and ran off in the direction that Hawkeye had gone. As for that Alice, it would be better to let someone else deal with her. Meanwhile, Grimm was having a hard time. Unexpectedly, that Lolita who went rampage hadn't chased after evil bugs, but had her eyes on him, who had only said a few words in the earlier battle. He covered his head and scurried away from her, like a rat to its hole. Behind him, the little Lolita was floating up 30 meters in the air, holding the bizarre birdcage and continually waving it in Grimm's direction. However, something was really puzzling Alice. It seems like this rascal had a pair of eyes the back of his head. Whenever her spatial attacks approached him, he would speed up and turn in another direction, making her attempts at targeting him come to nothing. If it was only 1 to 2 times, perhaps he was just having a lot of luck today. But with her continuously failing, Alice was certain that this beginner apprentice could sense the existence of her spatial energy, hence, she wished, even more, to kill him. It appeared that him finding the weakness of her protection barrier was not a freak accident, but he could really see the entire structure of her barrier by seeing through her spatial energy. In fact, this was a weakness of Alice's innate spatial abilities. Although her protection barrier was nigh invulnerable, it had a huge disadvantage. Once she used spatial energy to warp the fabric of space around her into a barrier, she became trapped in a relatively small space. Although that would spare her from suffering any damage from an enemy, she couldn't launch any attacks while the barrier was intact. Therefore, in order to allow her to attack, she had to leave a hole in her protection barrier, so she could manipulate her spirit energy to target an enemy. To avoid this hole being noticed, she purposely used invisible wind elementum and created a weaker barrier at that spot. The full-covered, invisible air barrier was about fist-sized, and, as long as an enemy knew nothing about it, no one would ever think that there was actually a hole on this protection barrier. No ordinary enemy could defend themselves from Alice's bizarre and frightening long-ranged attacks while probing the protection barrier inch by inch. That's why she was able to keep this big of a secret, and had earned herself the aplomb of being nearly invincible. But today, unfortunately, she had met with 2 special apprentice adepts at the same time. One was an advanced apprentice who had completely modified his body and was able to transform into countless scorpions. He also possessed a nasty and weird attack method. In the end, he was simply a cockroach who was nearly impossible to kill. The other one was just a weirdo. Although he was just a beginner apprentice, he was still able to expose her biggest secret. Also, it seemed like he could really see her spatial energy. In order to capture this weirdo, Alice had drawn on the highest energy she could use and, in the shortest amount of time possible, she had placed an invisible space trap in his path. But, seconds before this rascal ran into this invisible trap, he suddenly changed directions and dodged her ambush. Now, Alice had no doubts about his ability. Thus, her drive to catch him increased even more. After running for so long, Grimm had become extremely tired. Due to his lack of training and cultivation, his agility and physique were very low. If he had not covered his body with wind elementum to increase his speed, perhaps he would have long since been captured by that terrifying Lolita. He had a feeling that, if he really was captured by her, something extremely horrifying would happen to him. Thus, even though he was gasping for breath, he still clenched his teeth tightly and kept running for his life. The graceful wind elementum carried his body, reducing his weight by half, and allowing him to move through the muddy swamp at a relatively high speed. Sensing his physique was dropping fast, Grimm's face kept twitching as he began to panic. In his panic, he came up with a dangerous plan. Making up his mind, he turned to the right and sprinted into the depths of the swamp. He would never be able to escape by running, so Grimm decided to lure Alice to the habitat of Ghost Nanny. This area of the swamp was a bit different from the others. The rotten, stinking sludge and the slow-moving muddy water mixed together, and clumps of messily growing grass and other dirty waste were floating all over the place. The water in this muddy and filthy pond was not completely still but was flowing at an extremely slow pace. From time to time, bubbles and half-rotten tree branches would come to the surface. Indistinct wailing and moans of doom were sung above this misty pond, resembling the cries of the damned, and causing ice to go down the spine of any who heard this hallowing tune. There was trail went across this swampy area, but the dark trail and the muddy water had mixed together, so, for those outsiders, it was really tough to find the ruined trail in the midst of the filthy swamp. Within this swampy area, which covered nearly 30 square miles, there lived many different groups of ghost nannies. The smaller groups only consisted of 7 to 8 members and normally lived in the more remote regions this area. Meanwhile, bigger groups could have up to 100 members, and they occupied the largest region right in the center of this part of the swamp. As demons, Ghost Nanny only had basic intelligence. Usually, they were transformed from those humans who had accidentally drowned in the swamp. Although they had previously been humans, their minds were filled with an intense hatred and resentment towards all of humanity. For months, or even years, they would lie in ambush at the banks of the swamp. Once a living human came nearby, they would jump out, biting the flesh of their target, and dragging them to the bottom of the swamp, in order to drown them. With this method, they ensured their population kept growing. Their appearance closely resembled a skinny human lady. However, most of their muscle was missing and their skin became pale as the result of constantly soaking in muddy water. Add this together with their wrinkled and moldy bones, and they looked like a living corpse. While most were naked, those who had lived better lives as humans might be wearing a broken dress, though it was always so faded that it was impossible to tell what the dress had fully looked like, or even what color it had been.